The historic impact of Henry VIII is well known to most people. As the son of Henry VII, he cemented peace across England with the end of the War of Roses. But his stubborn determination to bear a male heir would change the history of the world and provide his longest legacy. However, the schism from Rome is not the only legacy Henry left, for it was Henry VIII that brought clowns to merry England. Not only was 1492 the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, it was also the year that Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Muslims, Jews, and clowns from Spain. Clowns had long been held in ill favor around Europe, and most nations took it upon themselves to follow Spain's example with regard to clowns. Until 1492, parents would scare their children into obedience by warning them to check under their beds for clowns. Modern etymologists across the Romance and Greek-based languages have traced the warning against a, quote, monster in the closet to early aphorisms which indicate the monster was pale-faced and smiling, and until very modern times, closet could be translated as just an inner room, perhaps a bedroom. This is why when Christ speaks of going into your closet to pray in order not to be seen of men, he didn't per se mean a place people hung clothing. Actually, very few people had that many clothes at that time. The law of Moses, in fact, commanded that if you took a man's garment as surety for a debt, you were to give it back at the end of the day for him to sleep in. Clowns were thrown out of towns and cities across Europe, and were on the run until Henry VIII invited them to England in 1515. Most people have heard of the Spanish Armada, but not the Clown Armada. The monk Ronald of Chichester wrote that, quote, the clowns came in every sort of vessel, many so unseaworthy and small, one scarce expected one man to gain passage in such a ship. Yet upon docking, the number of passengers pouring unto the deck beggared the imagination, and yet so they came. Historians have long agreed that Henry's slip from Rome was not only fueled by his desire for a male legacy and his pride, but also by his greed. For centuries, nobles had given their oldest son the estate as an inheritance. Then they had sent their second son off to war. And finally, the third son had been sent to a monastery with a chunk of money or property. When Henry nationalized the English church, a huge amount of property and cash came with the event. The dissolution of the Knights Templars is another example that some historians believe was motivated by similar avarice and greed. But in Henry's case, this may have motivated his invitation of the clowns. You see, the clowns traded sanctuary in the British Isles for loyal service to the crown. For several centuries, the British monarchy held a monopoly on over 90% of all cotton candy produced on the face of the earth. This is commonly depicted in many paintings of the era, in which Henry seems to be taunting the viewer by the fact that only he and his court could enjoy unlimited supplies of the confection. In this portrait, the casual observer would notice the king's harlequin-style legwear. But the Book of Clowns makes it clear that it is demonstrated in this portrait the fact Henry was flaunting his special relationship with clowns that allowed him to wear this special pattern. There are also rumors he was allowed to carry a giant sledgehammer and have 2 pet laughing hyenas, but those are rejected by most reputable historians. Henry VIII also employed clowns for political intimidation. While he repeatedly emphasized the presence of clowns at the royal council meetings was to boost the spirits of his counselors, nothing moves a meeting along faster than having a clown breathing down your neck until the meeting is over. Did the clowns report back to the king? The Book of Clowns is silent on the issue. But remember, the court jester had a special privilege of speaking their mind. Was it because they were a fool, or because they would share bits of information no one else knew? To maintain the clowns, Henry created permanent circuses across England. He also placed clowns on the estates of his nobles, often as a sign of his displeasure. Not only would these nobles be responsible for the feeding and upkeep of the circuses, but they had to sleep at night knowing there were literally clowns outside their windows. On the other hand, there was a marked reduction in home burglaries during this period of English history. The period following Henry's death was stable, but full of trouble. Between Mary's attempts to reinstate Catholicism as the state religion and the endeavor to place Jane Grey on the throne, there was plenty that the nation needed to be distracted from. England needed the clowns, and the clowns needed England. A symbiotic relationship was born, and while it wasn't immediately apparent, it would be born along with 2 other great English legends. Henry had waged a long town crier campaign to make clowns seem friendlier to the British public, and it seems to have worked. The reign of good Queen Bess saw a rise of English fortunes, which included the bard, William Shakespeare. While Shakespeare would feature clowns in many, many of his plays, the part they actually played in his success has been overlooked. Shakespeare wrote all sorts of plays, and this was true even before he became famous. In a little-known pamphlet from 1582, a forgotten critic named Asher Ringling wrote an op-ed in the Stratford-upon-Avon Weekly Planet, blasting the, quote, mindless upstart polluting the student theatres of our fair city with offal and dribble of the lowest sort. His accusations were dismissed by historians until the excavation of a Stratford print shop in the mid-2010s, where woodcuts were found for what are now considered proto-Shakespearean plays, with titles such as The Spanish Armada from the Center of the Earth, The 50-Foot-Tall Count, Plan 9 from the Outer Hebrides, and a perennial favorite, St. Nicholas Conquers the Atlanteans. In 1589, Shakespeare seems to have been at the end of his rope and needed a hit badly. So he wrote, directed, and starred in a low-budget play called The Clowns Under the Bed, Trundle the Clown and His Closet Full of Clowns. A horror flick about, well, an endless stream of clowns under a bed led by Trundle the Clown. We know about this because of the very short-lived practice of creating trailers for plays. This was a brief practice in the early 16th century in which giant sheets of paper would be printed with scenes from the play, and these would be shown before other plays, typically to narration by actors and sometimes even music from a band. Here is a 10-second clip that survived from the original play, The Clowns Under the Bed. It appears to be a conversation between Trundle and a very small child as to why Trundle should not eat the child. This play would change English literature forever, since, like most people, Shakespeare did not realize people were no longer as afraid of clowns as they had been. And The Clowns Under the Bed was such a terrible play, people thought it was funny. Not only did Shakespeare officially introduced the clown into English society, but he was so shaken by the course that his cheap horror flick took, he actually ended the use of these flip book trailers and was so successful no one ever used them again, which suited audiences just fine. They'd arrive at the theater when the play was supposed to start and have to sit through 15 minutes of trailers while they ate all their figgy pudding bites and drank all their coriander water, or barley water, or maybe something stronger. Then somebody would have to go back to the lobby of the Globe Theater and wait in line to get refills and miss the opening scene of the play. Then, without a doubt, somebody would ask in a loud voice if they missed anything, and in a loud voice someone else would update them about the opening of Romeo and Juliet. This being live theater with actual actors carrying actual swords somebody would come off the stage with a sword. And, well, it would take so long that everybody would end up in the lobby again for more figgy pudding bites and rose water. In his desperation to get a hit, Shakespeare had turned his keen powers of observation unto clowns, while doing research for the clowns under the bed. Comparing his plays to the Book of Clowns demonstrates just how close he was. In fact, in the years between Shakespeare and Cromwell, there would be many knockoffs who just didn't hit the right spot with audiences. Ronald McBarniam would try and fail with his traveling act, "You Might Be a Clown," with lines like, "You might be a clown if people run when they see you. Either that or they mistake you for the Spanish Armada. No, really, folks, I've got a cousin from Cornwall who's regularly mistaken for the Spanish Armada." Shakespeare learned his lesson maybe a little too well, if some historic evidence is to be believed. In the first draft of many plays, he would write in entire clown plot arcs, which would later be cut out for length, cost, or because they just didn't add anything to the plot. There have been many theses wrote over the clown plot arcs that Shakespeare did not put into his play. After the fall of the Soviet Union, researchers in Moscow found versions of Shakespeare's plays with deleted scenes included. For example, in Hamlet, there were several deleted flashbacks revealing a plot arc involving the clown Yorick leading Hamlet, Horatio, Father Christmas, and several clowns in a quest to toss a ring into a volcano in Iceland. In Romeo and Juliet, we believe he intended to save Juliet by having a clown from Austria break into the Capulet crypt and, just before she stabs herself upon finding Romeo's body, tell Juliet, "Come with me if you want to live." In Richard III, there is a deleted scene from the ending where Richard rides from the battlefield, uttering the words, "I feel the need for speed." Instead, Shakespeare wrote the "My kingdom for a horse" line. Like England and clowns, Shakespeare and clowns developed into a symbiotic relationship. He made clowns friends with witty repartee and wisdom, and clowns in turn publicized. By 1687, when clowns were finally thrown out of England by Oliver Cromwell, who also banned Christmas, nearly half a century of clowns had cemented their place in the English world and removed most of the sheer terror they had induced. Although, it must be pointed out, in defense of Cromwell, the holidays in England had gotten out of hand and were far too commercialized, as some newspaper headlines of the time reveal.